Hey, hello. This is the April community call. Probably a little bit of a short one and a quiet one this month. Several people are going to be on holiday soon for a long weekend. As usual, we'll have a demo and we'll go through the latest development work that's ongoing. This month, I'm going to hand over to Omer, who has been working with Sylabs for just over a month now, and he's been working specifically on advancing the OCI functionality in Singularity that's going to reach sort of parity with the native runtime when we have Singularity 4.0. And certain portions of that will also be backported. So I'll hand over to Omer so he can share what he's been doing.
Thanks, David. Can you hear me and see this terminal?
Yes.
Beautiful. Okay. So as David mentioned, I'm going to demo a few of the new bits of functionality we have in OCI mode. One thing I want to mention, but will not be demoing today, is we're adding support for mapping CDI devices in OCI mode, and we'll be talking about that and demoing it a month from now in the May community call. But onto things that we will be talking about today. I want to basically show you four little things. The first is Scratch. So we now have support in OCI mode for the -scratch flag, where you can declare some path in container for which tempfs will be mounted. You can see it's a tempfs mount. If you want more information, you can look at the mount for that. And that is a feature we only had in the native runtime. It's now available in OCI mode. Moving right along, another thing we've added is the ability to override the home directory of the user inside the container. So this comes in two flavors. Here's the first one. You declare --home and a name of an in-container home dir. Now, because of the way OCI mode in Singularity defaults to running, this too is going to be mounted as just a tempfs mount, but this is now considered to be the user's home directory, and you can see that through all the familiar ways. However, being tempfs, what you do here will, of course, not make its way out of the container. If you want to do that, let's look at the second flavor of -home. Let's just create a folder on the host. Let's make sure it has all the permissions so we don't run into any problems right now. And then what we can do is we can do a bipartite -home argument where up until the colon, we're specifying a path on the host, and then the path that this will be mounted on in the container. From the perspective of the container, things look very similar to before, except you'll now see that what's mounted on my home dir is something, an actual file system from the host. And indeed, if I were to create a file from inside the container, inside my quote unquote home directory, as far as the container is concerned, I can now see that that has been created in the host. The next thing we have support for now is changing the initial current working directory inside the container. So me. You can specify -- current working directory, CWD, and a directory to start from. This looks a little bit like specifying a custom home, in as much as that's where the container will start, but that's not mapped to the home directory. So if you do CD with no arguments, you'll see that the home directory is in fact the default one, but you're telling the container to start up in a different directory, right? Perhaps not the most useful thing in shell mode, but of course, much more useful in exec and so forth. I'm using shell mode just for the purposes of the demo. A note on the naming of this flag and backward compatibility. In other parts of Singularity, this has, in particular in the native runtime, this has been called --PWD in the past. That's still supported as a synonym, but we're transitioning to call it CWD, namely the initial current working directory, on the thought that PWD means print the working directory, and so it doesn't really make sense in the context of this command line. Finally, we've added support for overriding the host name inside the container. So if I were to start this without any additional parameters besides OCI mode, I would get the host name inside the container is identical to the host name where I'm running out here. But we now have support for overriding this. And now you'll be able to set the custom host name for the container. Lastly, as I alluded to, but I don't think I showed, all these things are, I've been using shell, so I can poke around and show you things for the demo. But all these things, of course, work in all the quote unquote action commands in Singularity. So for instance, exec, where we run the pwd command, supports the same custom initial working directory that I showed you for shell, and this extends to all four of these commands: the host name, current working directory, and scratch. I think that'll do for now. I'll hand this back over to David at this point.
Great, thanks. So yeah, as you can see, the kind of parity between the native runtime and the new OCI mode for running those OCI containers natively without any kind of translation into Singularity format is progressing. So Omer is going to be continuing to work on that. Are there any questions at this point about what's been shown or the OCI mode in general?
This might not be an OCI specific question, but is the size of the tempfs configurable by the user, or is that something hard-coded into Singularity or only set globally in a config file?
So there's a max session dir size, which is in the etc singularity.conf. So by default, it's very conservative because Singularity's traditionally been used in ways where you don't maintain much kind of temporary state in a container. You bind mount in and so on. So that is possible to change in the config file. There is a thought that we probably need to look at this as we go towards more OCI compatibility, where people are used to being able to write actually into the container a lot more at runtime to kind of expose this, and perhaps it will end up with kind of limits, but users can request up to those limits or something similar. Do you have any particular kind of thought about this?
That sounds reasonable. Yeah, like a maximum amount, and then a user configurable, maybe a small default with user configurable amount up to the maximum, that sounds like it would be reasonable.
Yeah, I suspect that's the way that it looks like it'll be implemented for the 4.0. I should mention actually some of these things that Omer's shown, the kind of additions to the OCI mode, they will be backported into 3.11 where it's possible and there's no kind of big behavior change. We marked the OCI mode as experimental so we could do this. So we can kind of gradually fill in the gaps in 3.11 that we can in order to get feedback from users before it goes to a kind of full release and becomes much more used at Singularity 4.0. Okay, anything else on that before we move on to the general development update? Okay, I'm going to share my browser and we'll take a quick look through the changelog now. So since the last release of Singularity, so since the 3.11 came out, there have been a few changes. What you've just seen with the OCI mode. Up at the top, you'll see that there's a small change to packaging. This hasn't gotten into a stable release. This will change with 4.0. There's the CWD flag, and that becoming the preferred form for setting a containers working directory rather than PWD, which Omer mentioned before. So these things are Singularity 4.0 targets as their change defaults and behaviors. We've had some additions to key handling so that you can deal with secret or private keys more easily, and the terminology of private is supported as that's commonly used. There's a feature added which is relevant to people who have access to a Singularity Enterprise instance. So this might actually be most useful for sort of Singularity Pro customers who also have Enterprise, but it's related to getting a CLI token so that you can directly interact with the OCI registry that a Singularity Enterprise instance provides. Omer mentioned in passing that we've added, or he has added rather, support for CDI. So CDI is the Container Device Interface, and it's a new standard to make hardware devices available inside containers. The idea is that you have on your host CDI configuration files in an etc CDI directory, and then you ask your runtime to make the device available using a device flag and a device name. And then the config file instructs the container runtime how to bind the device in, what libraries to make available, and the environment to set, and so on. So this CDI support is where things are going for GPUs in containers and other devices like FPGAs and so on being exposed in containers. Next month, we're going to demonstrate this, and we'll show an example with the GPU. But we're also going to have Evan from NVIDIA joining us, who has done a lot of work on the code behind this, which is now used in Singularity and Podman and the different container runtimes out there. He's going to talk generally about CDI, what it does, how it's being used, and the kind of broad adoption across the industry, not just with NVIDIA, but for Intel GPUs and so on. So if you're interested in that, make sure to join the next session, which is on the 4th of May. There's a few kind of miscellaneous things other than the OCI bits. The remote status command can now print the username and email of the logged in user. So if you're logged into like cloud.sylabs.io and you're not sure what your username was, you'll see that in the status output now. If we go down further to the bug fixes section, the first one here is a packaging issue. Some people may be building Singularity packages on SUSE Linux Enterprise Server. We've switched there from depending on crun back to runc, because although crun is available for SLES, it's part of the package hub community repositories that may not be enabled. So runc is in a more sort of core repository. So we're going to switch back to that. There's a fix for the OCI mode so that we apply ID mappings correctly when we're not running with a fake root. And then this last point is possibly the most important one to point out. So I'm going to jump over to an issue. We had reported recently that on Ubuntu Focal, people started seeing containers failing to run, and there was a message at the end saying it was due to no loop devices available. On kind of debugging this, what it's come down to is there was a patch in the Ubuntu kernel that they brought in recently within the past couple of weeks, and it changes the handling of a parameter for the loop back file system driver. So basically, when this max loop parameter isn't set, the behavior of allocating loop devices has changed a bit. Now, there's a workaround in the issue that I just brought up, and if we kind of scroll down, that workaround is to actually set the max loop parameter for this loop device driver. If you set it, then all the prior versions of Singularity will work properly. We've looked into it a bit more, and the bottom point here, a fix that's been merged onto the main branch now, changes the way we create new loop devices to use something called loop control in the kernel, and that avoids the issue entirely. Now, this loop control method, the reason we didn't use it before is because it's only been available in kernels 3.1 and above. And for a long time, Singularity had to support kernel 2.6.32 for Red Hat 6 and some older distributions. So we hadn't used this, this method. The actual issue is arguably a kernel bug because it's changed the user space behavior, and it kind of prevents allocating loop devices in the older way. So we will report that upstream, but there's two ways of getting around it. The workaround in the issue I mentioned, where we set max loop, or else this bug fix, which is on the main branch and will backport to the next 3.11 stable release. Any questions on this? Okay, that's really all we have for this week. We're just kind of quietly working away on these OCI features to get up to parity with the native runtime, and the rest of the stuff which is on the 4.0 roadmap, which I won't bring up because we've gone through it several times recently. So we can open the floor for any kind of general questions or comments or input. Otherwise, we will finish early. Anything at all? Okay, then. Well, this video that I've been taking will be posted to YouTube shortly. And like I've mentioned, please try and join us for the call on the 4th of May. when we'll have that demonstration of the CDI functionality to bind GPUs and that contribution from NVIDIA, which will be very interesting to hear about the kind of broader perspective around CDI too. Otherwise, thanks for joining us. And please don't hesitate to bring any questions to the Slack or the Google group if there's anything mentioned in this call that you'd like to talk about further.
Thanks.
Thanks, Didi.